Bonjour and welcome back. In our last lecture, we talked about the political life of the 1920s, and that was not much to report. The three presidents of the decade, Warren Harding, Calvin Coolidge, and Herbert Hoover, all three of them being conservative Republicans who had a very limited view of what government should achieve, and thus did little, whether it's at home or abroad, where they embraced an isolationist policy. So the more exciting developments will be taking place outside of Washington, D.C., where you have a whole new society that emerges, which in a way is the ancestor of our modern-day society, one governed by the mass media and a variety of fads. This is what I mean when I wrote new mores, mores being customs or habits. That is true when you look at women, for example. We had mentioned during the lecture on the progressives that in 1920, the 19th Amendment is passed that guarantees the right to vote to women all across the United States. So that's a major development. But there's also development in terms of the sexual habits of women that become slightly more promiscuous. If you look at the fashion of the Gilded Age, you'll notice that women were covered quite a bit. Not an inch of skin was visible except for their face itself. Everything else, even hands or ankles or the neck, would have been covered under layers of fabric. And it's always funny to look at 19th century erotica meaning porn, to see a woman maybe showing a tiny bit of her wrist or maybe her legs, and that's about as exciting as it's going to get within the context of the 19th century. By the time you get to the 1920s, the fashion changes quite a bit. The flappers, as they are called, they are more likely to show their ankles or even their calves, so gasp, even their knee, or their hands, or their elbows, or maybe have a tiny bit of a cleavage. Also, they will no longer wear the corset, that kind of undergarment that would make you have a tight waist, but also would suffocate you and prevent you from being active. So you get a sense of what their body is like underneath that loose garment. Some of them will be wearing lipstick or rouge, which before that would have been more the kind of thing that a prostitute would have been wearing, and now women that are supposed to be more of a decent society will be dressing like that. They might also be wearing shorter hair, and that's in a way a legacy of World War I. Many women were employed in the work industry in World War I, especially in Europe, where a lot of the men are drafted and there's a shortage of laborers. And just to make it a bit more comfortable or practical when you're working on an ammunition factory in Britain or France, women cut their hair short, they wear pants, they have more practical clothing because they now do some physical labor. And that was reflected in the fashion in France that eventually becomes a fashion in the US as well. Many of these women were inspired by Sigmund Freud, who is that Austrian psychologist or psychoanalyst who wondered about how our mind works. And at the risk of oversimplifying his theories, here's how it goes. That our mind is like an onion with different layers in it. At the very core of it would be our basic impulses, which we share with animals. What do we want to do? We want to reproduce ourselves, so we have a strong sex impulse, and we want to survive, so we want to protect ourselves from death. However, since we are human beings who live in a society with religion and various taboos, there are a lot of things that we cannot do. Religion in particular tells us that we should not have sex with the opposite sex, or at least there are rules, not outside of marriage, not before marriage, and even within marriage solely for the purpose of reproduction. And so there is a kind of a conflict between what we want to do, which is our inner impulse to reproduce, and what society tells us to do, which is don't have sex with your neighbor, even though you are coveting her. And so that struggle between those two layers of the onion would lead eventually to neurosis and other psychological ailments, and that's what Freud was interested in. The way his views are interpreted by the flappers in the United States is that you should just give in to your basic impulses, that we are animals, that we want to have fun, that is natural, that is fun, and if we try to go against that, then we might suffer some psychological problems, so we might as well give in. And so the kind of women that you see appearing in the novels of Francis Scott Fitzgerald, like This Side of Paradise, or the more famous novel, The Great Gatsby, they read Freud and they go out to parties with women and with men that they're not married to, and in some cases, gasp, they kiss. I don't want to overemphasize too much the liberation that happens during that time. The flappers are just a minority of the population. The rest of the population remains far, far more conservative. It's just the first step, and we'll pick it up from there in the 1960s, where we do a second wave of sexual liberation that is far more prevalent as part of the feminist movement of the 60s. A second big development in the 1920s would be the appearance of the mass media. And the media is just whatever you use to communicate. Initially, in the 19th century, the big medium of communication would be in the newspaper. And these were quite local. Every town, even a small town, would have a paper of its own, and you would have a local reporter writing most of the stories. So they would change a lot in what they reported and the tone of the paper from one town to the other. That changes quite a bit in the 1920s with the appearance of syndication. And syndication simply means that one article or cartoon will be reproduced in different newspapers. That's a good cost-cutting measure. And you'll see that if you open your local paper, you probably have an editorial that is something that somebody from the New York Times was writing, and then that gets syndicated elsewhere. Or if you open your Sunday paper, I hate to break it to you, but your local paper does not have a whole team of people doing cartoons. These cartoons are syndicated and can be appearing in every paper, in every Sunday edition all around the country. So the result of that is that more and more papers start to look the same, and that unifies the nation. The same is true with the wire service, things like the AP or the Associated Press. And these are services that will collect news all over the world or the US, and then they'll share that on the cable with all the newspapers. And that's another cost-cutting measure, because if you're a small regional paper in Louisiana, you can't quite afford to have a full-time reporter in Washington, D.C. or Paris or London. So it's better to rely on the AP to give you the raw news, and then you'll make your own articles based on that raw material. But again, that means that the tone of the paper, whether you're reading a paper that is a Miami Herald or Los Angeles Times or the Chicago Tribune, these would be quite similar as a result. The big medium that appears in the 1920s would be the time of the radio, and it plays the same role that the TV would play today. It has a pride of place in most living rooms. People gather around it to listen to syndicated shows that come out of Chicago and New York, the funnies, or maybe more classical music, or the news. And the entire nation starts to listen to the exact same thing at the same time, because these shows are made only in a handful of locations. There again, unifying the nation. The movies also coming to their own, and in the 1920s, these are black and white movies, and up until the end of the decade, they are silent movies. But despite the limitations of the medium, they are very, very popular. People don't have TVs, so it's not unheard of to go to the movies Friday and Saturday of every single week and watch a couple movies in a row, in the same way that people would turn on the TV all the time nowadays. And so these movies are made only in a handful of locations, such as, say, Southern California. So you have some actors that become famous all around the country, and people are listening to the same story, falling in love with the same people. Another way in which the country was more unified in the 1920s was the automobile. Of course, cars existed before the 1920s, but they were very unreliable and very expensive and very rare. In fact, the first time somebody even drove across the country was in 1903. If you're interested, there's a great PBS American Experience show about it. By the 1920s, by contrast, some of the roads that are very impassable are paved for the first time, and so it becomes easier to go from place to place, even in bad weather. And cars also become much cheaper due to the appearance of the Ford Model T. So now people start to venture a bit further away from their hometown, and the world that people knew, which was just maybe 5 or 10 miles away from where they lived, now spans 100 miles or 200 miles. That again has the impact of mixing the country further. And as a result, this became the era of Ballyhoo. And it's an old slang term that you could translate today as a fad, a kind of story that gets picked up, and everybody talks about that all over the country for about, 1 week, and then everybody forgets about it. And the 20s are definitely an era of fads. That for a while, people get all obsessed with Mahjong, which is a tile game, and everybody plays Mahjong until that's out. And the next year, 1925, the big story is Crossword Puzzles, and you have them everywhere. And in trains, the engineers have to place some dictionaries because the patrons are getting all excited about finding the clue to that 4-letter word, and they can't find it, and they get mad, and you need to have a dictionary in each wagon. Or the next year, then it's the bridge, that card game that becomes very big, and it goes on and on and on like this, fads. Some of this may seem silly to us, but then we also live in a world of fads, or Twitter storms, as we would call them today. One of the more famous examples of Ballyhoo would involve a man named Floyd Collins, who lived in Kentucky, where there's a huge set of caves called Mammoth Cave, a big tourist attraction. And the idea by Floyd Collins was to explore a new set of caves so that he could open it for tourism and make money. Except he was not too successful while going spelunking, which is a term for exploring a cave. I love that term. He got stuck in there, some rock shifted and his foot got stuck or something. And so you have a big rescue operation to try to get him out of trouble, which normally should be a very, very local story in Kentucky, but it is kind of an interesting story, so people come from all over the country to cover it. It's picked up by The Wire, and soon enough you have a huge media circus where people from all over the country are in Kentucky to figure out what happens to Floyd Collins. They try to pass food to him, they try to dig a new tunnel and so forth, and that lasts for something like 18 days when the entire nation is just consumed by that story. Until poor Floyd Collins dies, and day 19 everybody filed the last report and then goes back to their home city, and by day 20 everybody has forgotten who Floyd Collins ever was. Another story for Ballyhoo would be the man that you see there, Rudolph Valentino. And that's not his full name. You can look up online what the full name is. It's quite impressive. He was of Italian descent, so he had a long, very impressive name. But for the pictures, he was just Rudolph Valentino. A fairly good-looking guy, and that's it. He was the hot stuff for the ladies of the 20s. He played in a variety of movies that usually were in exotic locations. He might be the sheik in Arabia, and there's a lady who has been enslaved by a rival sheik, and so he goes out and rescues a damsel in distress, and they fall in love at the end. Except next week, come back, because there will be another story where he will be a pirate in the Caribbean, and then a rival pirate crew, the bad guys have stolen the daughter of the governor, and he has to rescue that damsel in distress. Pretty repetitive as far as the story is, and well, it's overacting. It's silent movies, so people have to make a lot of funny faces. But he was a huge, huge star. Until something terrible happened, in that he died in his prime as a young man. His funeral was a huge issue, something like 100,000 people showed up at the funeral. It was reported all across the country, and in the days that followed, you had several young women that went to his tomb and then killed themselves on his tomb because they could not imagine a life without Rudolph Valentino. The same happened in the field of sports. The 1920s is the era where spectator sports really comes into being. In the early days of the Republic, nobody did sports because people were mostly farmers, and that's before tractors and such, so people did a lot of physical activity all day long. And the last thing that you're going to do when you spend 12 hours in the field pushing a plow is hit the gym that night. You've had plenty of physical exercise. By the late 19th century, some people, like say the young Theodore Roosevelt, start doing gymnastics, as if, at least those who are in a more elite environment where they don't do much physical activity. So they start having a gym at home, and they like to do calisthenics, as they call it. Or even team sports, rugby, soccer, all of these are invented in the latter part of the 19th century in England. By the 1920s, you shift to something else altogether, which is people like to enjoy watching other people doing sports. And that's the period when Babe Ruth becomes a huge star in baseball, for example. Football is not quite the huge sport that it is today. Boxing, however, is much bigger than it is today. Heavyweight boxing is a huge thing. You have two famous bouts that pitted Dempsey against Tunney, to the big stars at the time. And there was the first game, the first bout, and then there was a rematch where something like 100,000 to 200,000 people showed up at the arena, and most of the people didn't know what was going on in the ring because they were all the way there in the nosebleed section and couldn't even see what was going on. But they were there, and that's the big thing. You have to be present because that's the big ballyhoo. That's what everybody's talking about. Even though you can't quite tell who even won, at least you were there. And then you have millions more that are listening to that on the radio, to the blow-by-blow account of the bout. And at some point in the rematch, one of the boxers went down, and normally you're supposed to count to 10 and call out a knockout. But the referee was telling the other boxer, you have to go back to your corner before I start counting. And the other boxer was getting super excited about that. And throughout the country, people were getting mad at their radio set that became known as the long count. And supposedly several people died of a heart attack during that crucial period. Again, we could mock those people as being somewhat naive, but I would like to know what would happen if during the Super Bowl there was a questionable call. I wouldn't be surprised if a few people choked on their Dorito or something. All these people are somewhat forgotten today. You probably never heard of Floyd Collins or Rudolph Valentino or Jack Dempsey. The last name on my list is far more famous even today, and that would be Charles Lindbergh, who was the first to fly across the Atlantic solo in 1927. And I want to emphasize direct and solo because some people had flown across the Atlantic before. There was a US Army team, for example, that did it, but they did it with stops as part of a team. And so Lindbergh, his main achievement is that he did it non-stop and alone. In fact, some French aviators might have done that before him, but their plane disappeared before it reached its destination, so it's not quite clear if they died after crossing the Atlantic or during the crossing of the Atlantic. But anyway, Lindbergh for sure crossed, and he took off from just outside of New York City, flew from west to east, and then landed at Le Bourget Airport, which is just north of Paris. And he became a huge star because he embodied kind of the spirit of American individualism and a great success. Plus, he was pretty good looking. Plus, later on, he married a young socialite who was from the upper class, so that was another huge story in the media. Then she got pregnant, yet another big story. The baby was a cute little thing, another big story. It's like the Kate Middleton and Prince William nowadays. And then, tragically, the baby was kidnapped, and that transfixed the nation for several days until, tragically, Charles Lindbergh Jr. was found dead. He had been killed by his kidnapper. Lindbergh's popularity kind of declined in the 30s and 40s because he was very far right in his politics, pro-Nazi, anti-Semitic, and so by the time World War II came along, he was seen as a bit of a national disgrace. But for much of the 1920s and 30s, he was the big thing. If you're interested in all that issue of the Ballyhoo, I would strongly recommend that you read the book Only Yesterday. It's a history book and an old one. It's from the 1930s. That's why it's called Only Yesterday. It was just right after the end of the 20s that one historian looked back on the previous decade. But it has a ton of very good anecdotes, including some that I used for that lecture, about the various incidents of Ballyhoo in the 1920s. It's a very enjoyable read, Only Yesterday. Or you could watch some movies, and there are quite a few good ones. I'm a big fan of the director Billy Wilder and the actor Stanley Kubrick, and the two are found in a movie called Ace in the Hole, which is directly inspired by the story of Floyd Collins, though it's not set in Kentucky. Other movies that are set in the 1920s would include Singing in the Rain, which is about the transition from silent movies all the way to talking movies. It's a delightful musical, great songs, great acting. And even more delightful would be Some Like It Hot, which is set in the 1920s. It's around the issue of the Valentine's Day Massacre, where there was some gang violence in Chicago connected to Prohibition. In that case, the story is that two witnesses have to escape to not be killed by the mafia. And so they hide in an all-woman band in Florida. And so you have Tony Curtis and Jack Lemmon who cross-dress, and one of them falls in love with Marilyn Monroe, of course. Who wouldn't? However, I don't want to give the mistaken impression that everybody in the 1920s is a flapper, dressing outrageously, or cross-dressing in the case of Tony Curtis and Jack Lemmon. At the same time, the American society was changing into something kind of close to what we have today, with the obsession with fad and the mass media. There is still a very, very old, conservative America that is still around. That's why I call old mores, old habits that die hard. Obviously, the politics of the time tend to be quite conservative. As you know, the three main presidents of the period are all Republican: Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover. And this is the era of Prohibition, when even drinking alcohol is something that goes against religion and then that is banned by the government. When the decade began in the early 1920s, right after World War I, there's a number of terrorist attacks in Washington, D.C. That get blamed on communists and anarchists. And as a result, the Attorney General at the time, Arnold Melcher Palmer, decided to round up a whole bunch of communists in what became known as the First Red Scare. In that case, he kind of betrayed the law in the sense that he used summary justice and rounded up anybody who was communist, whether they were involved in the attacks or not. And many of them are deported summarily to the Soviet Union, which was a communist country by then. So the fact that the country is very, very conservative means that there is some persecution of communists, some of them actually guilty of terrorism, others just expressing their free will. Keep that in mind, because by the time we get to the Cold War in the 1950s, it would be a second Red Scare. That's the one that would be associated with Senator McCarthy. Religiously, people remained very, very religious in the 1920s, and a good example of that would be the Scopes trial of 1925, also known as the Monkey Trial. It started in Tennessee when there was a law passed that would ban the teaching of evolution in schools. By that point, most scientists had embraced a theory of evolution that went all the way back to 1857 and Charles Darwin, but it went against the first passages of the Bible, and so conservative people in Tennessee wanted it banned even from public school. One local science teacher, Scopes, thought that this was ludicrous, that a religious agenda was dictating what he would teach in science, so he went ahead and taught evolution anyway, and was fined, and that's what led to the trial. That trial is famous because it brought in some very famous people. On the side of defending the state of Tennessee will be our old friend William Jennings Bryan, the populist from the 1890s, who used to rail against the gold standard and was still around. A very good lawyer, very famous, also very religious, so he sided with the law banning evolution. On the other side, reporting on the trial was H.L. Mencken, who was a journalist from Baltimore, a very sharp pen. You can still read his books today. They're very beautifully written. He was a master of the one-liner, and you did not want to cross him because he could destroy you in a single sentence, a very sharp wit. So he went to Tennessee and kind of covered the trial. In that case, he was very sympathetic to Scopes, thinking that this was just the hillbillies of Tennessee that were attached to some religion and were trying to push it on other people. Mencken, among other things, said before he went to Tennessee, he was not too convinced about the Darwin's teachings about us being related to other great apes. And after he got to Tennessee and met the people there, he was convinced, yes, we are apes. At any rate, the conviction of Scopes was upheld, and it did not appeal the conviction, so that was the rule. The old mores, in that case, won. The old-style America prevailed. Not all these battles are over yet. Even today, you have some fights over various school boards, especially in the South, to decide whether to teach evolution or not, even though it's fully accepted by science nowadays. Nowadays, people who are opposed to evolution will probably not try to ban it altogether. They'll try instead to teach it side by side with something that's more religiously inspired called intelligent design. So if you ever heard that expression, intelligent design, that's what it means. And I want to take this opportunity to make a little digression on the matter of the separation of church and state. I live in a rather religious and conservative area of the country, Louisiana, where most people are devoutly Christian, and it's not uncommon that at public functions like a meeting of the school board, a university function, the meeting starts with a public prayer in Jesus' name, amen, and everybody is asked to stand up and bow their head in prayer. And whenever I've raised a fuss about it, the answer was always, well, the United States is a Christian nation, and by the way, my freedom of religion is defended by the First Amendment, which is a big misreading of the law in that matter. Yes, the United States is a Christian nation in the sense that it has a lot of Christians in it, but the government itself is not affiliated with any religion. There is no place in the Constitution that says that the US is Christian. The First Amendment, which is the one that is relevant in our issue, does guarantee freedom of religion, but then it goes on to say that there is no established church, and that's called the Non-Establishment Clause. And what that means is that there is separation of church and state, that the government is not supporting a particular religion. What does that mean in practice? If you want to go to church on Sunday and bow your head in prayer, you're more than welcome to. The government does protect your right to practice your Christian faith, or Muslim faith, or no faith at all if you're atheistic. However, in a government function, the government cannot force people who are attendees, say at a university function, to go and pray alongside members of another faith. That's the meaning of the separation of church and state. Another good example of the strengths of fundamentalism in the 1920s would be the 1928 election, where Coolidge was not running. It was Herbert Hoover on the Republican side. And the Democrats picked Al Smith, who was a representative of kind of the wet liberal side of the party. He was a Democrat, an Irish American from New York, and also a Catholic. And so when he ran, he faced a lot of opposition to his candidacy, not so much based on his policies or who he was, but just the fact that he was a Catholic, because there had never been a Catholic president before. And the level of anti-Catholic animosity was quite strong in the late 19th and early 20th century. Many people thought of them as being not fully American, because the main allegiance was to the Pope in Rome rather than the Constitution in Washington, D.C. Anyway, this was a very conservative decade anyway, so he stood little chance, but by being Catholic on top of that, he faced some strong headwinds and was defeated in a landslide. After that, it was not until 1960 that a major party dared to put a Catholic on the ticket. In this case, he was elected. That was John F. Kennedy. And that's so far, I'm taping this in 2019, the only non-Protestant ever elected to the White House. Racially speaking, the 1920s were also quite bigoted. The Ku Klux Klan at first being created in the aftermath of the Civil War and Reconstruction as a way to terrorize black people from voting. But it experienced a resurgence in the 1920s. In fact, that's where it had the most members ever in its long history. And at that point, it was pretty much a mainstream organization where many people in small towns in America might be members of the Rotaries, the Lions Club, the Elks, the Kiwanis, or the KKK. There was not that much difference, even though the KKK had a very strong anti-black, anti-Jewish, and anti-Catholic agenda. Well, this agenda apparently gathered up millions of people all around the country. You have also terrible incidents of lynching, which is when you have a posse that exacts summary justice upon a person, usually a black person, though you have also incidents against Hispanics in the Southwest. And usually that starts with some crime, either a murder or maybe a suspected rape of a young white girl, which might or might not happen, but the crowd will immediately gather up a suspect who might or might not be the actual guilty person, and then have a summary justice where they are hanged from the nearest tree or in some cases burnt alive. You have some photos that are kind of disturbing from that period, and what's disturbing about it, aside from the lynching itself, is how huge a crowd you have to watch it, and people are wearing their Sunday best, and the kids have been brought along. That give you a sense of how mainstream that activity would be. And you have dozens of incidents like this throughout the 1920s. Yet another good example would be the Immigration Act of 1924. And in previous lectures, I mentioned that there's a lot of immigration in the late 19th, early 20th century in America, and that bothers many more old-stock Americans who don't want all these Italians and these Poles and these Russians, those Catholics and those Jews to come to the US. So in 1924, the Congress passed an Immigration Act to limit how many people could come to the country, so it's designed to limit immigration, and by setting up a quota system where only so many people from various countries could come. And those quotas very imaginatively were set not based on the kind of immigration that had been the case around, say, 1910 or 1920, with a lot of Italian Americans coming, but using a date much earlier in the 19th century as a starting point to set the quota before Italians and Russians and Jews came to the US. So the result is that you have a huge quota for, say, the British Isles, because you want people that are Episcopalians to come to the country, and a very small quota comparatively for people from Italy or Greece. And you definitely don't want people from China or Mexico or any country in Africa. So this was definitely based on the kind of people that you want to make to the US. It is bigoted in that case, and that remained on the books up until the 1960s, where as part of the Great Society program, Lyndon Johnson changed it to the current system that we have, that is based more on need, or whether you're married to a US citizen, or what kind of skill you can bring, rather than which country you come from. In fact, so conservative were the 1920s that a number of liberal intellectuals felt ill at ease in this country. And these became known as the lost generation, all these intellectuals from the 20s who felt that the United States was too conservative for them. Some of them kind of spent part of their life abroad. That would be the case of the famous writer Ernest Hemingway, who lived in Paris, who lived in Spain, who lived in Italy, in Cuba, or in the US, he lived in Key West, which is about as far as you can get from the mainland while still being on US soil, and really felt that he did not quite belong in the United States, not at least in the US of the 1920s. Another famous writer, well, famous at the time, he actually got the Nobel Prize for Literature, but not quite that famous today. I still like him. His name was Sinclair Lewis, and don't get him confused with Upton Sinclair, the writer of The Jungle. That's Sinclair Lewis, a different Sinclair. And he was the author of two major novels, one called Babbitt and the other one called Main Street, and both of them are about middle-bro life in America, in fictional towns that might be in Minnesota or Ohio. saw a very negative portrayal of American society, which is typical of all these intellectuals of the 20s that feel lost in American society. So that's it for the new mores and the old mores of the 20s, the many ways in which American society changes and doesn't change, and how does that relate to the present debates on immigration or the teaching of evolution or our own version of Ballyhoo. I will stop here. Next time we will talk about the economic life of the 1920s and be ready for a roller coaster ride. We'll start with a short recession and then a long upward thrust and then the Great Crash of '29 and the Great Depression. Au revoir. See you next time.